One of the biggest problems facing those that are falsely accused in the military justice system, aside from overzealous prosecutors that bend the rules and try to win at all costs, is lazy, incompetent investigators. Now, these are investigators from NCIS, CID, OSI that are supposed to be doing thorough, complete investigations. They are required to be unbiased, fair, neutral, and detached. And their objective is to look for the truth, to discover all the evidence that's out there, and to compile it and to make an informed decision about what happened and then pass that information on to prosecutors. That is the way it should happen. That's the way it happened when I first became a prosecutor and defense attorney in the military over 20 years ago. I would get investigative files where the investigator would research the accused, the one who's suspected, look into their background, their motives, their patterns, their friend group. They would then look into the facts of the allegation, what happened that night, what led up to it, what happened afterwards, and they would often use common sense and realize that in sexual encounters, unless someone's just attacked by a stranger on the street, there is a human dynamic to it. It isn't so cut and dry every time. It's not so black and white. It involves feelings, perceptions. It involves a lot of factors that you can't put a finger on. That's why you need as much data as possible to make an informed decision about what happened. They would also look into the alleged victim. And in a sexual assault case, where it's often one person's word against another, a person's background, their credibility, their truthfulness, their motivations, their history of lying, all of those things become highly relevant. So back then, the investigators would look into allegations. So if a woman would say, "I was raped 3 years ago by John," they should find out who is John, what were the circumstances, why 3 years later are you reporting, what has happened in between, and ask questions such as, were you in a relationship with John? When did it start? When did it end? When was the last time you had sexual relations with him? To try to paint a full picture and develop a full timeline. That's the way it should be done. Because let's say John and the alleged victim were in a relationship and he cheated on her, or he went back to his wife, or he dumped her and she started threatening him through text messages, or she started putting ultimatums out there, or telling her friends about what she was going to do to him if she caught him cheating again. Those would be all things that are relevant as to her motive in what happened. Those are things that should be uncovered in an investigation, but nowadays they are not. What's happening nowadays is that if there is a potential allegation, these military law enforcement investigators show up. Most of them are not that experienced. They're very naive and they are biased from the beginning. So they come in with a bias, and their bias is that they believe that something happened because they're trained to believe all victims and start by believing. Well, that means that from the beginning of the investigation, if someone comes to you and says something happened and you immediately believe them, then you're less likely to do a thorough investigation. So instead of going out and collecting key information like social media posts, text messages, phone records, restaurant receipts, camera footage from outside of the hotel or the dorm or wherever the alleged crime occurred, these are all things that would give you real-time information into the alleged crime, what happened. Instead of doing that and gathering those basic things, or even doing a basic thing like a crime scene search, they often show up at the crime scene, take a couple photos, and they don't collect physical, forensic, and scientific evidence. Because in their minds, why would they need to collect physical, forensic, and scientific evidence? We start by believing the victim. No matter what, the victim is telling the truth. So what happens is after they do their investigation that is usually insufficient, weak, biased, and all around half-assed, they send the case off to the prosecutors. And the prosecutors nowadays, a lot of them are used to seeing these weak, insufficient, emotionally charged investigations. The prosecutor takes it and they run with it. And the prosecutors are going into these court-martials with a weak, incomplete investigation that is filled with bias, and they're then trying to convince a jury of educated military service members. So you have a jury of senior enlisted and officers that now want to see some evidence. And they often don't have the evidence. And this cuts both ways, because someone could be guilty and they could be found not guilty because of the incompetency or the lack of investigation by the investigators. The same thing goes. Someone who's innocent can be put on trial, spend a ton of money, time, stress, and everything that goes with being taken to a felony rape trial, and they could be completely innocent, and they could have been exonerated if the investigators would have done their jobs. So we're seeing two things. We're seeing guilty people being found not guilty because of the lack of investigations and the bias of the investigators. This is a common thing. And we're also seeing people that are not guilty or are very likely not guilty, or cases where the government just doesn't have enough evidence and probably never will have enough evidence to get a conviction. And these cases are then going in front of a jury. And if the juries do their job and they follow the law, then that person will be acquitted. So then Congress is told there's more and more acquittals, the prosecutors don't know how to do their job, which is partially true, and the investigators aren't doing their jobs, which is absolutely 100% true. And so you have people that are actual victims upset that the person who assaulted them is being set free, and then you have people that are falsely accused having gone through the process, some of them getting convicted, by the way, and others just having lost a year or two of their life, and people were committing suicide rather than go in front of a jury, and all these other negative things that affect not just the person on trial, but affects everyone, from the witnesses to the victim to the alleged perpetrator. Everyone is affected by this incompetency that should be addressed from the beginning. Investigators should go back to the basics. You don't start by believing anyone. You start with an open mind, collecting evidence by not jumping to conclusions. You turn over every stone, looking for evidence for both sides. So if there's evidence that supports the defendant, you have a duty to collect that evidence and follow up on that evidence. If there's evidence that the defendant might not have done it, or if there's evidence that would impact the credibility of the complaining witness, you should bring it up and present it to the prosecution so that they can make an informed decision on how to proceed with a court case. That's not happening. We're seeing a lot of people falsely accused. We're seeing people that are guilty being acquitted, and at the top levels, they're just looking for numbers. They want people to report, and they want convictions. So whenever they get more people to report and they get less convictions, then they're running around wondering what's happening. It starts at the beginning. It starts at the investigation level. An incompetent investigation, a biased investigation, never leads to anything just.